When the war finally ended, silence fell not as a gift, but as a weight. For countless soldiers taken from the ashes of Europe, the silence of defeat was louder than any battlefield. In the months that followed Germany's surrender, tens of thousands of German prisoners of war found themselves scattered across distant lands, behind the fences of camps stretching from the heart of Texas to the farmlands of the American Midwest. They had expected punishment, maybe humiliation. What they never expected.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Was music. The year was 1945. Across the United States, more than 400 prisoner of war camps quietly housed former German soldiers, airmen, and sailors. The war had stripped them of their weapons, their homeland, and their purpose. For the first time, many of them were face to face not with the enemy they had been told to hate, but with ordinary American farmers, guards, and chaplains. The first days inside those camps were marked by confusion. The men waited for cruelty, starvation, beatings, or endless labor. Instead, what they found was order, decency, and something even more disorienting: kindness. It began in small ways. A guard offering a cigarette, a cook slipping an extra portion of bread, a local farmer nodding at them in passing. To the prisoners, such gestures were unsettling. They had been fed endless propaganda about their captors, brutes, monsters, machines of vengeance. Yet here they were, treated with an unexpected sense of dignity. The Americans had their rules, yes, but those rules were built on principle. Geneva Convention posters hung inside the camp offices. Medical care was provided, mail was delivered, and even the right to religious service was observed. Still, there was one thing the Americans could not control: the silence of defeated men. Every evening, as the camp lights dimmed and the sound of the wind brushed against the fences, hundreds of soldiers sat quietly, staring at nothing. Some carved bits of wood into tiny figures. Others scribbled poems or letters they could never send. But mostly they sat in silence, a silence that carried guilt, regret, and the haunting echoes of what they had seen and done. In one such camp in the southern plains, the silence broke one afternoon in a way no one expected. A young prisoner, once a clarinetist in a small-town orchestra near Bremen, was seen sitting beneath the watchtower, tapping his knee to a rhythm only he could hear. The guard on duty, a man named Lieutenant Harris, watched curiously as the German hummed a melody, soft and uncertain. Harris didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tune. It was Beethoven. The next morning, the lieutenant made a quiet inquiry to the camp commandant. "Sir," he said, "one of them plays music, real music. Would it be a problem if I found him an instrument?" The idea seemed almost absurd. These were enemy soldiers, men who had once fought under the same flag that brought destruction across continents. But Harris persisted. He argued that music might calm them, perhaps even restore some order to their restless spirits. The commandant, a pragmatic man who had seen the human cost of war up close, finally agreed. Within a week, an old clarinet, its keys tarnished and case worn, arrived from a nearby town's schoolhouse. When the German prisoner held it in his hands, something changed in his eyes. The camp fell silent that evening as the first notes drifted across the fences. Hesitant at first, then steady, confident, alive. Men who hadn't spoken in days turned toward the sound. Some closed their eyes, some wept. It was as if the soul of Europe, buried under rubble and loss, had found a fragile voice again through the instrument of a defeated man. The next morning, others approached the guards with quiet requests: a violin, a flute, even a drum. Word spread that many of the prisoners had once been musicians, teachers, orchestra players, or village band members before the war consumed their lives. To the surprise of everyone, the American officers didn't dismiss the idea. Instead, they organized it. They allowed the prisoners to form a small musical group, a camp orchestra, as it would come to be known. To outsiders, it seemed trivial, but for those inside the fences, it was life returning. Music became their escape, their confession, and their redemption. Each evening, as the sun set over the camp, the faint strains of Schubert or Brahms would rise above the barbed wire, blending with the sound of crickets and wind. Guards listened quietly, some pretending not to notice, their eyes growing misty. For many of the Americans, it was the first time they saw their former enemies not as soldiers, but as men, fathers, sons, and dreamers. But not everyone approved. Some locals complained that it was wrong. Why should prisoners be allowed joy when so many American families mourned their dead? A few even wrote to the newspapers demanding the pampering stop. Yet the camp commandant stood firm. Discipline is not cruelty. If these men find peace in music, perhaps it teaches us all something about what peace should look like. Inside the camp, the orchestra grew. Instruments were donated by churches and schools, sometimes anonymously. American guards joined in on occasion, teaching them new songs, folk tunes, hymns, even jazz pieces. At first, the Germans were hesitant to play anything but their classical works, but soon something remarkable happened. They began blending the two worlds, German symphonies and American melodies, creating something entirely new. Their music was neither one nation's nor the other's. It was human. For the prisoners, this was more than entertainment. It became a way to atone, to express what words could not. Some wrote letters to their families describing how they played under the American flag, never imagining such a sight could exist. Others began reflecting on the ideals they once followed blindly. The Americans treat us like men. It is confusing, and yet it gives me hope for Germany. At night, after the performances ended, the guards often lingered by the fence, listening to the last fading notes. They would talk quietly among themselves, wondering how it was that their former enemies had brought beauty into a place meant for captivity. And the prisoners, those who once saw America only through the lens of wartime hatred, found themselves confronted by a question they could not escape. What kind of enemy lets you play Beethoven behind barbed wire? They didn't yet know it, but this unlikely experiment in compassion and culture would ripple far beyond the fences. For now, the orchestra was only beginning, but already something profound had changed on both sides of the wire.
For a long time, the orchestra was little more than a curiosity, a handful of men with borrowed instruments, rehearsing under the hot southern sun. Their music carried on the dry wind beyond the fences. But as weeks passed, something deeper began to unfold. What had started as a humane gesture turned into a quiet debate between two worlds, one built on the logic of punishment and another on the stubborn belief that even an enemy could still possess a soul worth saving. Among the American officers, this division became evident. Captain Morgan, a former teacher before the war, championed the orchestra from the beginning. "You can't reform a man by breaking what's left of him," he said to his colleagues during one officers' meeting. He believed that the music gave the prisoners structure, meaning, and a sense of humanity that years of propaganda had stripped away. Others disagreed. Lieutenant Baker, a pragmatic soldier who had lost his brother in the Ardennes, saw it differently. "Music won't change who they are," he said coldly. "We bury our boys and they play waltzes." The argument never turned hostile, but it mirrored the same conflict stirring beyond the camp's fences. Across America, newspapers began to pick up the story of the singing Germans. Some praised it as an example of American decency and moral strength. Others condemned it as sentimental weakness. Editorials debated whether compassion for the defeated was a betrayal of the fallen. In a time when many Americans still carried the fresh pain of loss, forgiveness was not an easy melody to play. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Inside the camp, the prisoners themselves were undergoing a similar struggle. The orchestra had given them a sense of order, but it also forced them to face the contradictions of their past. The conductor, a middle-aged former music teacher named Ernst Vollmer, had once directed a civilian orchestra in Hamburg before the draft had torn him away. He was respected by the men, quiet and disciplined, but his face carried the burden of a man trying to reconcile pride with shame. During rehearsal, he demanded perfection, meticulous tuning, precise tempo, emotional restraint, but behind his eyes, the guilt was always there. He had served not as a fanatic, but as a man swept up in history, and the thought of now playing under American permission gnawed at him. One evening, after rehearsal, a young violinist named Hans approached him. "Herr Vollmer," he asked hesitantly, "why do we play for them, for the Americans?" Vollmer didn't answer right away. He looked at the barbed wire, at the guard towers silhouetted against the fading light. Then he finally said, "Because music does not belong to them or to us. It belongs to whoever still believes beauty can exist after madness." That line spread through the camp like wildfire. It was repeated in whispers, in letters, even scratched onto the walls of the barracks. For the first time, the prisoners began to talk not about the past war, but about the world that might follow it. The orchestra became their forum, a place where questions of guilt, redemption, and hope found a voice that neither speeches nor arguments could provide. The Americans noticed the change too. Discipline problems declined. Work details became more orderly. When Sunday concerts began to be held inside the camp yard, even the guards stood quietly, listening from the edges. The music that had once been a distraction was becoming something like a bridge, fragile but real. Yet outside, the tension over its meaning continued to build. One Sunday afternoon, a local journalist arrived, sent by a regional newspaper to report on the camp's unusual practice. He was skeptical from the start. "You really let them play concerts?" he asked Lieutenant Harris. "For what? To make them feel at home?" Harris simply nodded toward the stage. "Listen," he said. The journalist stayed, notebook in hand, through the entire performance. The orchestra played Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. The notes rose softly, uncertain at first, then grew stronger, richer, echoing across the compound. The final chords faded into silence, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Even the guards stood still. The journalist closed his notebook slowly and said, "Maybe that's what unfinished means." The article he wrote a week later carried the headline, "Enemies Who Remember How to Be Human." It spread far beyond the state lines. But not everyone shared the sentiment. Veterans groups protested. Letters poured in accusing the camp officers of dishonoring American sacrifice. "My husband didn't die in Italy for German serenades," one widow wrote to the War Department. A senator from the East Coast called for stricter treatment of POWs, citing the orchestra as an example of moral decay. "We cannot comfort those who brought us grief," he declared on the Senate floor. The story of the orchestra, meant to be a symbol of decency, had become a battlefield of conscience. Meanwhile, inside the camp, another conflict brewed. Some of the prisoners, especially those still clinging to the old ideology, saw the orchestra as a betrayal. "We are soldiers, not entertainers," they sneered. A small faction even attempted to disrupt rehearsals, mocking those who participated. But Vollmer stood firm. "The war is over," he said simply. "If you still wish to fight, fight your own hatred." Slowly, resistance faded. Even the most hardened prisoners could not remain untouched by the nightly music that filled the air. In time, many joined in, not out of surrender, but out of something far more difficult: understanding. The orchestra grew larger, better, more organized. American officers began to invite local townspeople to attend the concerts under supervision. It was controversial, but curiosity overcame bitterness. On one autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the yard, dozens of locals stood beyond the outer fence listening to the Germans perform an American hymn, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The irony was sharp, almost unbearable. Yet as the final refrain echoed, "His truth is marching on," some of the listeners found tears on their cheeks. They're prisoners, but tonight they sound free. Captain Morgan saw it too. After the concert, he stood beside Lieutenant Baker, the officer who once opposed the orchestra. "Still think it's just a waltz?" he asked quietly. Baker didn't answer. He just watched the men packing their instruments, heads bowed, careful, humble. "Maybe," he said finally, "but maybe they're the only ones learning the tune." In those moments, a new kind of reflection began to take hold, one that went beyond victory or defeat. The Americans had conquered militarily, but here in this small camp, the question became moral. Could the victors remain humane without losing their strength? Could mercy coexist with justice? Could the same hands that fought also rebuild? For the prisoners, the question was equally haunting. Could dignity survive after guilt? Could beauty emerge from ruin? Could music of all things become a kind of confession? Night after night, their rehearsals gave shape to these questions, though answers never came easily. Vollmer often said that each piece they played was a letter to a world they no longer knew how to reach. By the end of that year, winter winds swept across the camp, carrying the sound of rehearsals into the long nights. The men's breath turned to mist as they played, but they kept going, fingers trembling in the cold, eyes fixed on the conductor's raised baton. When the last note faded, there was no applause, only quiet nods, a mutual understanding that something larger than them was forming. The orchestra was no longer just an act of kindness. It was a confrontation between old wounds and new possibilities, between vengeance and vision. The Americans and Germans stood on opposite sides of a fence, but the distance between them was beginning to shrink, not by politics or negotiation, but by the fragile thread of sound drawn from wood and string, breath and will. And as the year turned, no one yet knew that this experiment, this improbable harmony, would soon find an audience far beyond the camp itself. By the early months of 1946, the small orchestra that had begun with a single clarinet had evolved into something extraordinary. What had once been a curiosity had now become a disciplined ensemble of nearly 50 men. They had a repertoire that ranged from Bach and Brahms to improvised versions of American folk tunes. Inside the barbed wire compound, they played every Sunday afternoon beneath a wooden pavilion built from leftover lumber. And for a few fleeting hours each week, the sound of captivity transformed into something resembling freedom. The Americans had not planned for this to grow as it did. The orchestra was meant to be a modest experiment in morale, a distraction for idle men waiting for repatriation. But as the performances continued, their fame spread. Reporters came and went, photographers snapped pictures of uniformed Germans with violins and cellos, and soon the camp commandant began receiving letters, requests from nearby towns asking if the POW orchestra could play for local events or church gatherings. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Let enemy soldiers out of the camp to perform concerts for civilians? But then again, the war was over, and America was rebuilding its sense of what victory should mean. The decision came after weeks of debate between the War Department and local officials. Finally, permission was granted for a single trial performance, strictly supervised, with armed guards present, and under the condition that the prisoners returned to the camp immediately afterward. The chosen event was modest, a benefit concert for war widows and orphans in the nearby town of Ashland, held inside a school gymnasium that smelled faintly of chalk and linseed oil. The date was February 23, 1946. The announcement stirred unease. Many townspeople objected. "Let them dig ditches, not play concerts," one veteran muttered at the local diner. Others, particularly teachers and church leaders, argued that if music could remind people of shared humanity, then perhaps it was worth the risk. The night of the performance arrived with a sense of uneasiness that hung like fog. American soldiers stood by the doors, rifles slung over their shoulders, their expressions unreadable. Inside, rows of folding chairs filled slowly as residents, widows, and children entered, their faces uncertain. Then the prisoners came in, escorted but unshackled, carrying their instruments with careful hands. They wore plain khaki uniforms marked PW in black paint, not the trappings of pride, but the quiet dignity of men who had lost everything. The audience fell silent as they took their seats on the makeshift stage. The conductor, Ernst Vollmer, bowed slightly, his posture straight, his eyes calm but heavy. He lifted his baton, and without a word, the orchestra began to play. The first notes were from Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. It was a deliberate choice, peaceful, reflective, and unpolitical. The music flowed through the gymnasium like warm light breaking through clouds. The audience, stiff at first, began to relax. Children leaned forward in fascination. Some of the widows closed their eyes. By the second movement, something shifted in the air. The music seemed to erase the lines between enemy and victor, grief and grace. When the final notes faded, there was silence, not awkward, but reverent. Then, unexpectedly, the orchestra began another piece. It wasn't in the program. Vollmer had made a quiet decision that morning, one he hadn't shared with anyone but the musicians. It was an arrangement of The Star-Spangled Banner, played not with fanfare or military rhythm, but slowly, solemnly, as if it were a prayer. For a moment, no one moved. The guards straightened unconsciously. The audience, uncertain, listened in stunned stillness. The anthem ended softly, without flourish. Then, from the back of the hall, someone began to clap. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause. It was hesitant at first, then thunderous. Some stood, some wept openly. That night, the local newspaper printed a headline that captured the mood: "German prisoners play for America and find forgiveness in the music." The story spread quickly, carried by national wire services. To the surprise of many, the response was largely positive. Letters arrived from across the country, from mothers who had lost sons, from veterans who had fought in Europe, from teachers and musicians who saw in the event something they couldn't quite explain. "If music can heal even for a night," one letter read, "then perhaps we've begun to win the peace as well as the war." Inside the camp, the prisoners were stunned. They had returned that evening to their barracks in silence, carrying their instruments as if they were sacred relics. For many, it was the first time they had been applauded by those they once called enemies. "It felt like absolution," one violinist wrote in his journal, "not because we deserved it, but because someone believed we could still be human." Others could not find words. They simply sat together, sharing cigarettes in the cold night air, the echoes of applause still ringing in their minds. For the Americans, the event had its own impact. Guards who once regarded their duty as routine now found themselves watching the prisoners differently. "They looked like our own boys up there," one sergeant said afterward. "If I didn't know better, I'd have thought they were part of our band." The camp commandant, a man not easily moved, admitted in a letter to his superiors that the orchestra had done more to maintain order and morale than any disciplinary measure could. Yet not everyone celebrated. Across the ocean, Allied officials, still dealing with the ruins of Europe, questioned whether such leniency sent the wrong message. There were fears that compassion could be mistaken for amnesia. And within the camp itself, some prisoners struggled with guilt.
Vollmer, the conductor, lay awake for nights afterward, wondering whether he had done the right thing. "We play," he wrote in his diary, "but for whom? For them, or for the memory of what we once were?" His conscience was torn between gratitude and shame. But something irreversible had begun. Following the Ashland concert, more requests came in. Churches, hospitals, and even military academies invited the orchestra to perform. Each event carried its own tension, its own risk, but the results were always the same: quiet astonishment followed by reconciliation. Over time, the orchestra became a symbol not of indulgence, but of moral strength. It showed that America's victory had not only been military, but moral, that its power rested not just in might, but in restraint. Months later, as spring arrived, the orchestra performed its most important concert yet, inside the camp itself, before an audience of both prisoners and visiting American officers. The final piece was not German or American. It was a simple arrangement of an old European folk song known to both sides. The lyrics, translated loosely, spoke of home, loss, and the long road back. When the music ended, there was no applause, just stillness. Even the guards seemed unwilling to break it. One soldier, barely 20, whispered to another, "It's strange. You'd think they were free men already." That night, Vollmer stood alone near the fence, staring at the distant town lights. Lieutenant Harris approached him quietly. "You gave them something tonight," he said. Vollmer shook his head. "No," he replied, "you did. You let us remember who we were before the war told us who to be." Neither man said anything more. The moon rose above the watchtowers, the barbed wire casting thin shadows on the ground. From somewhere in the barracks, a faint melody drifted again, soft, uncertain, and yet filled with a kind of hope that defied logic. For the first time since the war had ended, it seemed that both sides had begun to understand what victory truly meant. The orchestra would go on to play several more concerts before the prisoners were eventually repatriated. But the impact of that first performance outside the camp would remain the story's turning point, the moment when punishment gave way to possibility and enemies became something else, fellow survivors of a world that had nearly forgotten how to listen.
The following morning began like any other within the compound. Reveille sounded through the crisp autumn air, and the familiar shuffle of boots echoed across the gravel as the prisoners lined up for roll call. The war, for them, was technically over, but its shadow remained in the hollow of their eyes and in the measured way they moved. Most of them had accepted that they were now part of a machine larger than their understanding, the Allied effort to rebuild what the war had shattered. Among them was a former music student named Erich Bauer, a young man from Leipzig who had once dreamed of becoming a conductor before he was drafted into the Wehrmacht. During the first weeks of his captivity, Erich kept to himself. He helped with farm work, followed orders, and rarely spoke. But when one of the American officers, a calm, middle-aged man named Captain Harold Whitman, overheard him humming Bach while mending a fence, something quietly shifted. Whitman approached him one afternoon and asked in slow, accented German, "You like music?" Erich nodded, uncertain of the captain's intentions. "I studied before the war," he answered cautiously. Whitman simply said, "Maybe we can use that here," before walking away, leaving the young prisoner both puzzled and uneasy. Days passed and rumors spread through the camp that the Americans were planning something unusual. It wasn't more work or stricter discipline, quite the opposite. The officers had requested any prisoners who could play a musical instrument to report their names. The news traveled like electricity. Some thought it was a trick, perhaps a strange form of interrogation. Others believed it was propaganda. But curiosity eventually overcame suspicion. By the week's end, more than 20 dozen names were on the list. Former violinists, cellists, a few brass players, even a man who claimed to have played percussion in a Berlin cabaret band. Their instruments, of course, were long gone, but the Americans assured them they would find a way. A few days later, the trucks arrived from a nearby town carrying an assortment of old instruments, some cracked, some rusted, all worn from years of use. There were violins with missing strings, dented trumpets, and a single battered upright piano with faded ivory keys. The prisoners stood silently as the guards unloaded them into a makeshift hall, a converted barn that smelled faintly of hay and machine oil. When Whitman gathered them that evening, his message was simple. You have been soldiers, you have fought hard, but now perhaps you can fight for something else. Peace. The words hung in the air like a strange melody no one quite knew how to play. That first rehearsal was chaos. The instruments were out of tune, the players rusty, and the air thick with tension. Eric tried to direct them, standing awkwardly before the group with a stick in hand. Every attempt to synchronize ended in disarray. Some laughed nervously, others clenched their jaws, embarrassed. One man slammed his bow on the floor, muttering that it was a fool's game. The Americans mock us. But Captain Whitman didn't interfere. He simply watched from the back of the hall, his arms folded, as the prisoners stumbled through a broken version of Beethoven's Ode to Joy. It was disjointed, off-key, and barely recognizable. But it was music. When the session ended, the prisoners lingered. No one spoke of the mistakes. No one ridiculed the effort. Something had begun to stir in them. Not pride, not yet, but a faint sense of purpose. For the first time since their capture, they had done something that didn't involve survival or orders. Over the next weeks, the orchestra, as they began to call themselves half in jest, became the camp's heartbeat. Each afternoon after work, the barn filled with the sounds of tuning strings, tentative scales, and the growing murmur of cooperation. The guards would often stand at the windows watching quietly, while local farmers passing by would stop to listen, their faces softening at the unexpected sound of German music in the American countryside. Eric, once withdrawn and silent, found his voice again, not through words but through rhythm and motion. His hands guided the musicians, his eyes caught their mistakes before they became disasters. He scolded, corrected, encouraged. The men responded to him as they might have once responded to an officer, but this time, obedience was replaced by shared passion. It wasn't long before Whitman made another announcement. The local town is hosting a community event. They've invited you to play. The room fell silent. Some prisoners exchanged skeptical looks. To play music before Americans, civilians no less, seemed unthinkable. They will throw stones at us, one man whispered. But Whitman assured them, they won't. They'll listen. Preparations began immediately. Uniforms were pressed, instruments repaired as best they could. The prisoners rehearsed late into the night, their breath fogging in the cool air, sweat mingling with dust. Every wrong note was corrected, every rhythm tightened. Even the most cynical among them began to feel a flicker of anticipation. When the day arrived, they were escorted by truck to the nearby town square. It was decorated with lanterns and banners, and the townspeople gathered in cautious curiosity. The Drummond prisoners stood in formation, instruments in hand, their faces pale but determined. Eric stepped to the front, heart pounding. Whitman gave a small nod. The first notes of Beethoven's Egmont Overture rose hesitantly, then grew strong and full. The crowd, at first murmuring, fell silent. The music filled the air, not as the voice of enemies, but as something human, fragile and universal. When the final note faded, the audience remained still for a heartbeat, then erupted in applause. The prisoners looked at each other in disbelief. Some smiled, others wiped their eyes. Eric stood frozen with his baton trembling in his hand. In that moment, the walls that had divided conqueror and captive, victor and vanquished, seemed to dissolve. As they returned to the camp that evening, the atmosphere was different. The guards treated them with quiet respect, and the men themselves walked taller, as if the music had restored something that war had taken.
For Captain Whitman, it was proof of something he had long believed, that mercy was more powerful than punishment, and that even those shaped by conflict could still create beauty if given the chance. But for the prisoners, it was something deeper. They had found not only redemption, but also remembrance, a reminder that even amid defeat, the soul could still sing. That night, as the camp lights dimmed and silence settled over the barracks, Eric sat awake, staring at the stars through the barbed wire. For the first time in years, he felt not like a prisoner, but like a man again. The war had broken their bodies, but the music, the gift allowed by their captors, had begun to mend their humanity. And somewhere beyond the fences and the fields, the echo of that orchestra drifted into the night, the sound of former enemies learning note by note what peace truly meant.
Years passed after the war's end. The camps were dismantled, the barbed wire removed, and the once guarded barracks turned into empty fields again. But the echoes of the music that had once filled those barns and halls refused to vanish. Eric Bauer, now a free man, returned to a Germany in ruins. Cities he once knew as vibrant and proud were now heaps of stone and smoke. Yet in the midst of all that destruction, he carried something that no bomb could destroy: the memory of what happened inside that American camp. The sound of men rediscovering their humanity through music, the sound of forgiveness disguised as a melody. For a time, Eric wandered, playing in small cafes, teaching children, and writing music that no one had the heart or money to buy. Germany was a land of ghosts then. Everyone was either mourning, rebuilding, or trying to forget. One winter morning, a letter arrived for him from overseas. The envelope was yellowed and bore an American postmark. Inside was a single page written in a familiar, precise hand. Dear Eric, I hope this letter finds you alive and still making music. I often think of the night you and your men played for us in the town square. You didn't know it then, but that night changed me. I saw something the war had hidden from me, the truth that even our enemies could hold beauty in their hands. I am now helping to organize an event here, a concert for reconciliation. We want musicians from both sides to perform together. If you can come, the stage is waiting for you. Harold Whitman. Eric read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly. He had not heard that name in years, yet it was impossible to forget. The American officer who had turned a prisoner's despair into harmony. 2 months later, he stood again on American soil, not as a captive, but as a guest. The event was being held in a vast concert hall in New York City. Banners of peace hung from the balconies. The audience was filled with veterans, families, diplomats, and faces that had once been divided by war. When Eric stepped onto the stage, dressed in a plain black suit, the hall fell silent. To his left sat American musicians, to his right, German. In front of them, the same kind of battered instruments they once used in the camp, preserved now like relics of a strange miracle. And there, standing at the edge of the stage, was Captain Harold Whitman, older, grayer, but unmistakably the same man. They looked at each other for a long moment. No salute, no handshake, just a quiet recognition that words could not reach. Whitman stepped forward and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we do not play as victors or vanquished. We play as men who learned that mercy can make music louder than hatred." Then he nodded to Eric. The orchestra began. The first notes were soft, hesitant, searching. Then, as the melody grew, it filled the hall with a depth that silenced every cough,
every whisper. They played Ode to Joy, just as they had in that camp years before, but this time it was whole. No missing instruments, no fear in the air, no barbed wire watching from the shadows. As the final movement soared, something extraordinary happened. The audience began to stand, first a few, then hundreds, then everyone. Tears streamed down faces that had once looked across battlefields at each other through the sights of rifles. Even veterans who had sworn never to forgive felt their hands rise in applause, unable to stop themselves. When the last note hung in the air, there was no division left in that hall, only a single, trembling silence before the applause erupted like thunder. Eric looked up into the lights and for a brief moment thought of the men who didn't live to see this day, his comrades, his captors, the nameless dead who lay across continents. He raised his baton high, as if saluting them all. After the concert, as the crowd dispersed, Whitman and Eric finally spoke. Neither knew quite what to say. They simply stood there, surrounded by the fading echoes of the orchestra, knowing they had just witnessed something larger than both of them. Whitman finally broke the silence. "Do you remember what I told you that first night in the barn?" Eric smiled faintly. "You said we could fight for something else, for peace." Whitman nodded. "You did, and you won." The two men parted without ceremony, no grand farewell, no newspaper photographers, no headlines. Yet what they had done would ripple quietly through time. Years later, historians would uncover the story of that camp orchestra, how the American officers had chosen compassion over punishment, and how music had healed what politics could not. It became one of those forgotten miracles of war, the day enemies created beauty together. In his later years, Eric founded a small conservatory in Berlin dedicated to teaching music to children from all nations. On its front wall hung a simple inscription in both German and English: "Harmony begins where hatred ends." When he died, one of his former students, a young American violinist, played at his funeral. The piece was the same Ode to Joy that had once been heard behind barbed wire and later beneath chandeliers. Those who listened said it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like gratitude. Because in the end, it wasn't about prisoners or guards, Germans or Americans. It was about what happens when mercy becomes stronger than memory, when the sound of forgiveness drowns out the echo of war. And somewhere, if you listened closely enough, you could still hear it, the faint, eternal resonance of that impossible orchestra playing in a place beyond victory or defeat, playing the song of what humanity can be when it remembers its own heart.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.